The first red flag was not the sudden meeting invitation, titled Streamlined Transition Mandatory Attendance. It was the fact that they scheduled it for 5:53 in the morning. That was the kind of time slot selected by someone who spent too much money on gym equipment, owned a ring light, and possessed no conscience. Russell Thorne walked into conference room C with the calm of a seasoned systems architect who had triple-checked his backups. His hair was still damp from his shower, and he had thrown a leather jacket over a rock band t-shirt. He held a black coffee in one hand. Across the table sat Bradley Jenkins, the chief technology officer, flanked by two human resources representatives who looked prepared for a funeral. "Russell," Bradley said, smiling with the synthetic warmth of a luxury electric car with a dead battery. "You have been an asset during our journey. However, as we modernize our core infrastructure, some legacy positions must evolve, and some legacy personnel must evolve as well." The senior human resources representative, Brenda Fowler, nodded in agreement, reading directly from a laminated script designed to simulate empathy. She explained that this was a redundancy-based departure and did not reflect on his individual performance. Bradley chuckled softly, adjusting his designer glasses. "The simple truth is that software replaced you." Those 4 words were all he chose to say. There was no expression of gratitude, no offer to retain his deep technical expertise, and no appreciation for his dedication. It was just a smug, triumphant declaration, similar to a child boasting that he had automated his mother's meals. Russell stared at the man for a long moment, saying nothing. He merely tightened his grip around his paper cup until the plastic lid cracked slightly under the pressure. The human resources representative handed him the exit folder as if it were a reward, and not the professional obituary of the man who had written the code, running their entire logistics network. Russell flipped to the 4th page and saw the date. They had scheduled his termination precisely 2 days before his contract's auto-renewal clause was set to trigger. They were attempting to outplay him. "Do you have any questions?" Brenda chirped, scribbling a note. Russell looked up, his eyes scanning the chief technology officer as if mapping the security holes of a poorly configured firewall. "I wrote the software license," Russell said evenly. Bradley smiled even wider, clearly not paying attention to the gravity of the statement. "Of course, and we value your past work," the chief technology officer replied, dismissing him with a wave of his hand. "That is why we are flying in the new engineering group next week. You will have a chance to conduct a thorough handoff before your final day. It should not take more than a few hours." Russell nodded slowly, his neck muscles tense as he restrained himself from pointing out the absolute stupidity of the plan. The meeting concluded like a bad divorce, filled with forced handshakes and empty wishes. Russell walked back to his desk, logged into the terminal one final time, and recorded the date and time in an encrypted file. The license rollback countdown had officially begun, with 58 hours remaining. By the time the office lights shut off that evening, Russell had secured his personal archives. He backed up his commit history, his private design documents, and his contingency plans. Section 12F had been buried in the core licensing headers since version 3.4.7 of the platform. It was a clause that no executive had ever questioned, and frankly, none of them had bothered to read. They assumed it was standard boilerplate. The clause explicitly stated that the involuntary termination of the original creator would void the deployment license, making auto-renewal inapplicable upon separation and causing the activation key to expire immediately after a short grace period. The corporate legal team had rubber-stamped the contract 8 years ago because they never paid attention to the engineer who built the foundations they stood upon. They would learn their lesson very soon. The final exit interview smelled of industrial floor cleaner and corporate despair. Russell sat across from a junior compliance officer, Chloe Miller, who looked like she had practiced her professional demeanor in front of a mirror. She went through the checklist with the energy of a clerk processing library books. Laptop surrendered, building access card deactivated, and his company phone placed in a padded envelope. Russell signed each document with sharp, precise pen strokes. Each signature felt like a final bell tolling for the 12 years of labor he had dedicated to this enterprise. The junior compliance officer reminded him that his non-disclosure agreement remained active for 5 years post-termination. She warned him against sharing proprietary architecture, client data, or administrative logs. Russell merely blinked, keeping his thoughts to himself. They did not realize that he was the system itself. They were trying to lock out the architect who had built the fortress. The human resources manager chimed in, sipping an energy drink. She mentioned that their new engineering partners were scheduled to take over maintenance next week, and they were already proposing to migrate the entire system to cloud containers. Russell smiled faintly, wishing them luck with the inevitable system panics. He watched the digital clock turn to 1:48 in the afternoon, the precise second his status changed to terminated. That timestamp was now logged across 8 servers and 5 databases. Russell reached into his bag, pulled out the unsigned severance agreement, and slid it back across the table. "I am declining this severance package," he said. The compliance officer stared in disbelief, warning him that he would forfeit his payout. Russell shrugged, stating that he could manage without it. He stood up, adjusted his jacket, and walked out of the building without a word, ready to let the countdown run its course. By 10:15 the following morning, Russell was back at the headquarters, armed with nothing but his badge and an extremely patient expression. Management had requested that he train the incoming development team before his departure. They referred to this process as a knowledge transfer, as if a person could easily download 12 years of professional expertise, sweat, and long nights into a 45-minute slideshow between a catered lunch and passive-aggressive office jokes. He sat at the head of the conference room table with a cheap projector humming loudly beside him. The 5 engineers representing the new contracting firm wore matching hoodies and stared at their laptop screens like distracted students. The leader of the group, a cocky graduate named Austin Briggs, wore noise-canceling headphones throughout the initial presentation. He smirked as he leaned back in his leather chair, barely acknowledging Russell's presence. He whispered something to his colleague, who let out a quiet giggle. They behaved like tourists visiting a museum, interested only in taking snapshots rather than understanding the history behind the exhibits. "Slide 8, Russell said, clicking the remote to change the display. "This is the traffic arbitration layer of the Zenith Core platform. It is not documented in detail, so please pay close attention. If you deploy this module without adjusting the mutex weights in the node scheduler, the entire system will deadlock under a heavy load." Austin raised his hand without looking up from his screen, claiming that his team would likely rebuild the entire architecture on a modern cloud provider using microservices and containers anyway. Russell smiled faintly, noting that replicating the multi-node failover mechanism from scratch would be extremely difficult, especially when one of the nodes acted as a deliberate illusion to prevent older database systems from crashing. Another developer blinked in confusion, asking what that meant. Russell clicked to slide 10, explaining that the technique was called protective spoofing. He explained that he had developed it during the critical 2015 logistics outage, back when a failing database server threatened to corrupt the entire database and halt deliveries nationwide. At that time, the incoming engineers were likely still learning basic programming in high school. The room fell silent except for the sound of keys tapping. One developer in the corner made a note, looking as if he were trying to write down a magic spell. They were not truly listening to his warnings. They believed they could easily reverse engineer complex systems using basic search engines and optimism. They could not see the hidden complexities because they did not understand the context of the decisions. By noon, the knowledge transfer session had turned into a series of superficial questions. Austin was watching entertainment videos on another tab. Another engineer attempted to impress the group with a joke about migrating all system logging to a free online database. Russell remarked quietly that he hoped their client contracts would tolerate the resulting latency issues. By 1 in the afternoon, Russell returned to his desk for the final time. Most of his personal belongings, including his favorite coffee mug and a notebook filled with system diagrams, were already packed into a cardboard box, but he sat down anyway to complete his final ritual. He logged in with his credentials, which had not yet been revoked by the inactive technology department, and opened the master commit log of Zenith Core. He saw the history of 12 years of development containing over 18,000 individual commits. His work was visible in every module, including the recovery routines, the database scripts, and even a small Easter egg that showed a sleeping cat on the administrator dashboard during holidays. Russell sat in his chair, taking in the familiar sounds of the office. He looked at his keyboard, the letters worn down from years of typing commands, and remembered the countless problems he had solved at this very desk. He opened the file manager, preparing the clean repository of Zenith Core. The upload was slow, a steady progress bar that felt like a quiet countdown to his liberation. He knew that once this code left the network, there was no turning back. He selected the final production branch, labeled Zenith Core Prod version 8.6.3, and executed a clean export of the system. He removed the company labels and replaced the license headers with the copyright of his own entity, Thorn Systems LLC, which he had registered in Delaware 7 years ago. He compressed the repository, encrypted the files twice, and transmitted the archive to a secure dead drop email account with a simple subject line. The message read Legacy Load. No one would discover the transmission except him, and eventually the next client willing to pay for his services. The moment felt quiet and heavy, like the atmosphere before a massive storm. He opened the user administration panel, entered his system code, and navigated to the screen that controlled credentials. He selected his user profile and deactivated it, cutting his digital connection to the platform he had maintained, with his own effort and far too many cups of black coffee. As he walked out of the department, he encountered Bradley Jenkins in the hallway. Bradley was holding a green beverage. Heading out, Bradley asked, speaking as though Russell were simply leaving a social gathering early. Russell did not slow down. "I would wish you luck," he said without looking back. "However, I think you will need something far stronger than luck." He left his security badge on the reception desk and pushed through the heavy glass doors into the bright afternoon sun, ready to watch his plan unfold. The thing about professional revenge is that it does not materialize out of thin air. It accumulates slowly, like rust beneath chrome, quiet and relentless. Russell had not always been the kind of developer who could dismantle an entire logistics company with a single set of instructions. He had started his career as the dedicated engineer who volunteered to work late, fixing broken database scripts, while the office cleaning crew quietly swept around his makeshift sleeping space on the floor. 12 years ago, the platform that eventually became Zenith Core was nothing more than a chaotic collection of notes and poorly managed repositories. The company, Ethel Logistics, was a mid-tier freight handler masquerading as a modern technology corporation. Their software systems were held together by luck and quick fixes. Russell made the system function. He did not just make it run, he made it resilient enough to survive severe challenges. There was a notable night during the 2012 data center fire when a faulty cooling unit threatened their main database servers. While other executives panicked, Russell drove to the central office in his casual clothes and rerouted the network traffic from the lobby using his personal laptop. He did not receive a substantial bonus for his efforts. Instead, they presented him with a cheap corporate coffee cup that read Ethel Team Member. The handle of the mug broke within a week, but he continued to dedicate his life to the infrastructure. The long nights transitioned into weekends, and the weekends became years. He missed family gatherings, put off personal vacations, and skipped countless meals to ensure the platform remained stable. There were nights he woke up in a panic from system notifications, reciting error codes in his sleep. The software he built was not merely lines of instructions to him. It represented his life's dedication. His code contained comments written like quiet prayers, warning future developers not to touch delicate logic blocks, because only the creator remembered how they functioned. Then came the organizational changes of 2018, which resulted in a 15% reduction in force. Human resources classified it as strategic optimization, but Russell recognized it as a clear warning. They terminated the senior administrator who had co-authored the original deployment routines, leaving him with no notice. Within 3 weeks, the staging systems collapsed because No one else knew how to configure the security keys. After working through the night to resolve the issue with a temporary script, Russell quietly added Section 12F to the licensing engine. It sat inside the metadata library like a sleeping security measure, completely ignored by leadership. It was a single line in a vast forest of legal jargon. If the original author was terminated without cause, the license would expire. The corporate legal team approved it without review. The technology directors never read past the summary pages, and marketing would not have recognized a license key if they saw one, so it remained there, waiting for the right moment. The company managed freight across 48 states, coordinating hundreds of shipping routes and dealing with massive delivery schedules. They relied on local warehouses that were often poorly managed, and the communication between their dispatchers was constantly breaking down. Russell had integrated their schedules, mapped their delivery routes, and built an automated reporting system that saved them millions of dollars in manual coordination costs. They had taken his solutions for granted, assuming that the software was simple to maintain because it ran so smoothly. Now, sitting on his couch with a warm blanket and a quiet television show playing in the background, Russell browsed his professional social media feed. Bradley Jenkins had posted an update titled, "Tomorrow is Here, Athel Launches Automation." The post was filled with empty buzzwords, celebrating innovation and the elimination of outdated legacy processes. It felt like a public celebration over his 12 years of dedication. The post even featured a generic picture of smiling developers, standing before a whiteboard covered in meaningless charts. His throat tightened with a familiar anger. They had not just terminated him, they had attempted to erase his entire legacy. He bookmarked the webpage, knowing that those words would soon look incredibly foolish. He opened his personal system and checked the status of the license manager, verifying that the Heartbite check was active. The countdown was ticking toward midnight. Russell exhaled, feeling a sharp clarity. He had once been a loyal, dedicated worker shaped by empty promises and coffee. Now, he was focused and determined. Ethel Logistics was about to experience the consequences of trying to automate the developer who had designed their entire foundation. To ensure there would be no mistakes, Russell booted his personal computer, a powerful custom-built machine that hummed quietly in the corner of his living room. He navigated to his private database dashboard, which was connected to the license tracking server he had hosted independently. He had established Thorn Systems LLC not as a tool for revenge, but as a standard business practice to protect his independent consulting work. At the time, he wanted to ensure that any derivative works or custom utility scripts he created outside of his core duties would remain his intellectual property. The company's legal department had signed the agreement without a second thought, eager to close the contract and begin using his deployment framework. They never anticipated that this minor administrative detail would become their greatest vulnerability. The interface displayed a clean timer, showing the time remaining until the next license check. The system would perform its check at exactly 1:15 in the morning. He verified that the cryptographic key was set to nullify and that his registration documentation was fully prepared. Thorn Systems LLC was ready to enforce its rights. He felt no hesitation, only a cold sense of professionalism as he watched the timer count down the final minutes. At exactly 1:15 in the morning, the first license verification request was initiated by the system, as it had done every 9 hours for the past several years. However, this time, the verification endpoint returned a status of 4001, indicating that the license was unauthorized. The activation key had officially expired. The system did not immediately crash. Instead, it began to fail gradually. One by one, the critical microservices failed their validation routines, and the node clusters ceased communication. The caching engine froze, causing transactions to queue and eventually corrupting several database records. By 1:18, the monitoring dashboard displayed empty screens rather than metric data. The night operations technician assumed it was a simple interface glitch and restarted his screen, but nothing changed. He posted a message in the internal communications channel, but no one replied. The technician, a young contractor named Colin, sat in the dark operations room, watching the red lights flash across his monitoring panels. He had only been with the company for 6 months, and this was the first major outage he had experienced. He tried to run the standard recovery scripts, but each attempt was blocked by the license error. He felt a cold sweat run down his neck as the database tables began to lock up, realizing that the entire network was failing under his watch. At 1:56, the West Coast database began dropping freight orders from the processing queue, leading to backlog errors. At 2:28, a validation error halted the synchronization of East Coast shipping containers. At 3:14, the main load balancer reached its timeout limit and shut itself down completely. By 4:46 in the morning, the chief technology officer, Bradley Jenkins, was awakened by a series of urgent messages from the lead operations engineer. The message warned him that the entire system was completely down. Bradley did not take the time to dress. He opened his tablet while still in his pajamas, muttering in frustration. He logged into the primary administrator interface, but the screen immediately turned red, displaying a message that the license had expired, and that renewal was required through Thorn Systems LLC. His face turned pale as he attempted to bypass the check, clear the system memory, and restart the processes. Every action was met with the same error, confirming that the system was bound to the original creator and revoked upon termination. At 5:15, the chief executive officer was contacted directly by their largest logistics client, who complained that warehouses were unable to print shipping labels and that tracking services had failed. This failure meant that thousands of trucks were idling at the gates, unable to load or unload. The chief executive officer paced across his study, holding his phone to his ear. He was shouting at Bradley, demanding to know why the system could not be restored immediately from their secondary servers. He reminded Bradley that every hour of downtime cost the company hundreds of thousands of dollars in lost business and damaged client relationships. The logistics partner was already threatening to cancel their freight contract if the system was not back online. Meanwhile, at the corporate offices, the junior developers Russell had trained were struggling to locate the basic system logs, as none of them knew how to access the custom interface Russell had built. One developer actually searched online for instructions on how to reset the administrator password, failing to realize the complexity of the database. The platform was collapsing in slow motion, generating thousands of unresolved errors that no one could decipher, because the logging codes had never been documented by the new team. When a manager suggested restoring the database from a backup, Bradley admitted that even the backups would perform the same license check and fail, rendering them useless. The compliance officer, Chloe Miller, was also dragged into the emergency conference call. She realized with a sinking heart that the contract Russell had refused to sign was the very key they needed. If he had signed the severance package, they might have claimed rights to the code. But he had declined the terms, leaving Thorn Systems LLC in full possession of the copyright. She explained to the board that Russell's actions were protected by standard software licensing laws. If they attempted to run the software without a license, it would constitute direct copyright infringement under federal law, carrying massive penalties. By 7:30 in the morning, 22 separate communication channels had turned into active arguments between departments. The legal team was attempting to contact Russell, while the operations group tried to find a way to revert to an older software version that no longer existed. The finance department was busy calculating the potential damages, realizing that a $35 million penalty clause would be triggered by noon if the systems remained offline. This penalty was driven by idle labor costs, shipping delay fines, and canceled shipping routes. Russell, however, was walking through a quiet park just after sunrise. He wore a warm hood, listened to quiet music, and carried a thermos of hot tea, looking completely relaxed. He watched a bird land on a nearby bench and smiled. The morning was clear, the corporate network was silent, and the automation he had set in motion was running perfectly. His phone began to vibrate, showing a series of missed calls from the company, and a text message begging him to discuss a resolution. He placed the phone back in his pocket, deciding to let them wait a little longer. The emergency board meeting began at 5:51 in the morning, which was 45 minutes earlier than originally planned because corporate panic rarely waits for convenient scheduling. The virtual meeting room chimed continuously as exhausted executives joined, each displaying the strained look of someone watching a multi-million-dollar business collapse. Bradley Jenkins sat in silence, his camera turned off, and his voice shaking when he finally spoke. He admitted that they were dealing with a licensing issue tied to their core systems, likely triggered by the termination of their lead architect. The chief executive officer demanded to know why they did not own the software, reminding the team that they had paid for its development. The head of legal, looking pale and clutching a printed copy of the original contract, interrupted. She explained that while they had paid for the work, the contract explicitly left ownership of the core engine with the developer under specific conditions. She read Section 12F aloud, detailing how the license was voided upon involuntary separation without cause. She pointed out that ownership reverted to Thorn Systems, LLC, registered 7 years ago in Delaware. The chief executive officer was stunned, realizing that the platform running their entire distribution network belonged to the man they had just fired. Bradley attempted to explain that they were trying to negotiate a resolution, but the head of legal noted that Russell's attorney had already replied with a message stating that the terms would be enforced as written. The chief financial officer pointed out that they had shipments delayed across multiple hubs, with a $35 million vendor penalty looming at noon. The chief executive officer ordered them to reach Russell immediately and offer whatever terms were necessary to restore the systems. At that moment, Russell was sitting in a local cafe, drinking coffee and watching the messages accumulate on his phone. When he finally joined the conference call, he did not dress up for the occasion. He wore his favorite rock t-shirt and held a mug, looking completely calm. Russell logged into the Zoom call from his dining table, wearing a simple rock band t-shirt. He took a slow sip of his black coffee, listening to the frantic voices of the board members as they argued about their options. He did not interrupt their discussion. He simply sat in silence, waiting for them to finish their debate. When the chief executive officer finally noticed his presence and asked for his input, Russell spoke with a calm authority that immediately quieted the room. The corporate lawyers immediately tried to argue that the company had implied ownership due to their investment, but Russell remained unmoved. He held up a copy of his copyright registration, explaining that he had registered Zenith Core under Section 106 of Title 17, United States Code, 7 months ago. He explained that any continued use of the platform without an active license constituted direct copyright infringement, which could carry statutory damages of up to $150,000 per violation. Bradley attempted to appeal to his sense of fairness, but Russell reminded him of the statement that software had replaced him. He pointed out that since the software was now gone, they were left with nothing. The chief financial officer asked for his terms. Russell stated that they could license the platform at double the previous rate, paid annually in advance, with a consulting agreement that retained him as the principal architect for the next 3 years. He also demanded a public retraction of the blog post celebrating his replacement, requiring the company to credit Thorn Systems LLC for building the core system. The public retraction was a non-negotiable term for Russell. He wanted the company to publish a formal statement on their main corporate portal, acknowledging that the Zenith Core platform was the sole property of Thorn Systems LLC and was licensed to Ethel Logistics under strict commercial terms. The statement had to remain on their homepage for 30 days, visible to all clients and partners, ensuring that his professional reputation was fully restored. The board had no choice but to accept. The chief executive officer agreed to sign the contract without modification. Later that evening, sitting at a quiet restaurant overlooking the water, Russell received the signed agreement. He opened his laptop, reviewed the signatures, and authorized the reactivation of the license. Within minutes, the servers at the headquarters returned to service and the operations channels reported that the systems were functioning normally once again. Bradley Jenkins resigned his position that same afternoon, leaving without a farewell announcement. The new contract guaranteed Russell a consulting fee that was 4 times his previous salary, along with design authority over the platform for 36 months. He closed his computer, took a slow drink of his beverage, and enjoyed the quiet evening. He sat at a small wooden table, watching the tide slowly roll in under the golden hues of the setting sun. The cool breeze carried the scent of salt and eucalyptus, and the distant sound of waves crashing on the shore provided a calming rhythm. He knew that he had protected his work and established his true value. This outcome demonstrated that real influence in the modern workplace does not come from loud arguments, but from technical knowledge, careful planning, and a clear understanding of legal rights. It served as a reminder to every professional that loyalty should never be given blindly to organizations that view personnel as replaceable assets. Honestly, the most dangerous employee is not the loud one. It is the one who listens, documents, and waits. This story shows that real leverage is not noise, it is knowledge. There is something satisfying about turning betrayal into power without ever raising your voice. Thank you for reading, and make sure to subscribe to the channel, unless you are my old boss, in which case you are on your own.